Hello, welcome to another Patreon video. I am Joel with a new haircut, and it's almost summertime. I wanted to take a little bit of time with this video to kind of introduce you. I'll give you a little overview of the new book that some of you will be getting, Christianity in the Revolution in Worldviews in Western Culture. A brief overview of Christianity and the development of Western civilization and why it is important to understand if one is to make sense of our world today. In case you're unaware, there's a lot of controversy in our culture today and a lot of upheaval. And a lot of people are at each other's throats and stuff. So part of the point of this book is to try to give an overview of Western civilization, to see how our processes of thought have progressed and evolved, sometimes revolution-wise, revolve, to the point where we are today. So in order to understand where we are today and how to navigate the present controversies and stuff, I think it's sometimes good to go back and look at the past and see what has brought us to this point. And so the book tries to give that overview of Western civilization from the time of ancient Greece all the way up to the modern period. And I find it fascinating. The background to writing the book was basically when I was teaching at my last Christian high school, I was developing Western civilization course for my seniors, and I had initially started using the Francis Schaeffer book, How Should We Then Live, which was written in the 70s. And I used that, but over the years, the more I used it, the more I was disappointed with it because I would do my own reading and research, and I started kind of writing my own book. And long story short, when I left that high school, I kind of put all that on the shelf, so to speak, and this last year I've decided to take it off the shelf, try to fashion it into a book, and that is the product of, this is the product of my efforts. And so I'm happy with it, and I think it's basically my attempt to understand and make sense of Western civilization and how we got to where we are. So that's what it is, and some of you will be getting it, and if you're not getting it, hopefully you'll buy it. But I thought I'd take this brief video to give you a general overview of how I lay the book out. Now, the purpose of the book is basically, I kind of put it in the preface, and I'll tell you it right now. The purpose of the book is fourfold, basically. The first is to kind of challenge the modern Enlightenment narrative of the past. Believe it or not, you probably have a modern Enlightenment narrative of the past. It's the very way you talk about the past, you do. You talk about the classical period of ancient Greece and Rome, and then we call that middle 1,000 years or so the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. And when we think of that period, we think of Monty Python, the Holy Grail, and superstition, and people writhing around in mud, and all that bad stuff. And then after that, what do you talk about? The Renaissance, the rebirth of learning out of that Dark Ages stuff. You have the Renaissance and the Reformation, reforming that Dark Ages stuff. And then after that, you have Enlightenment, the new light that brings back the light of classical learning. Not like that Dark Ages stuff. And we go on to the modern period and beyond. Well, that whole way of talking about history was really a product of the Enlightenment. Certain writers like Rousseau and Voltaire, they kind of made up those categories for a reason. They hated the Catholic Church and they hated Christianity, and they wanted to like poo-poo everything associated with the Catholic Church. And the fact was, for those 1,000 years, the Catholic Church was the main cultural factor in Western Europe. And so Voltaire and Rousseau and the boys kind of wanted to slander that whole time period. And in reality, as I talk about in the book, what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages was anything but dark and full of superstition and bad. I mean, in any age there's some bad stuff, but there's tons of incredible stuff going on in the Middle Ages that is worth noting. And so the first goal of the book is to kind of fight back against that, what I call that false narrative of the so-called Enlightenment. The second aim of the book is obviously, I wanted to trace the positive cultural shaping impact that Christianity has had in the world over the last 2,000 years. And so When I talk about ancient Greece and Rome, particularly Rome, and I talk about the emergence of Christianity during the Roman Empire, I contrast the Christian movement with the worldview of the Greco-Roman world, and kind of show just how impactful and revolutionary early Christianity was. And then from there, all throughout history, I try to show how the Christian worldview has shaped our culture for the better. So that's the second purpose of the book, to push back against the so-called Enlightenment narrative, to emphasize the cultural shaping impact of Christianity and the Christian worldview. And then the third one, the third aim of the book is, I'll just read it. The third aim of this book seeks to emphasize and understand the challenges to Christianity within Western culture, be it corruption from within the church or attacks from without. So another thing you'll find out when you read the book is, although Christianity has had a huge cultural impact for the good in Western culture, there's always challenges, there's always corruption, sometimes within the church, attacks from without the church, and how Christianity has dealt with that in the past. So I kind of emphasize that as well. So, and then the fourth aim is basically to highlight as clearly as I can the fundamental issue that lies at the heart of virtually every philosophical endeavor, and to show how the conclusions made about that issue end up impacting everything in any given society. In other words, how a certain age addresses certain challenges and issues and how it just views things, how that impacts greater society and the following era. There's kind of a flow to history, so to speak, and I kind of track that. So in any case, those are the four basic aims I have in the book. Fight back against the so-called Enlightenment false narrative, to emphasize the cultural impact that Christianity has had, to talk about the challenges to Christianity in each age, and the fourth thing is to get at the fundamental philosophical heart of how each era attempts to understand reality, basically. And so, now the way the book is set out is slightly different than the typical way most Western civilization books are laid out. Normally they're laid out like I just said earlier. Greco-Roman world, Dark Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, Modern Age. That's how the progression goes. But I don't accept those categories because I think they're misleading. I start with the Greco-Roman world. I have a chapter on ancient Greece and the philosophy of ancient Greece. I have a chapter in ancient Rome. So ancient Greece and Rome are basically the same. Where I differ is I don't use the term Middle Ages and I don't have it take up 1,000 years. I break it up into two different parts. The first part, basically from the year 300 to the year 1050. That is what I call the Byzantine Age. And I call it the Byzantine Age is because it really begins when Constantine becomes a Christian. And all of a sudden Christianity becomes, it's not the imperial religion of the empire, but it no longer becomes a persecuted religion. And it has a huge amount of cultural impact because the emperor is a Christian. And so from 300-ish to 1050-ish, I call the Byzantine Age, and I talk about how Christianity and I talk about how Christianity shaped the culture from that imperial mindset. Okay, and that's when the Byzantine era was kind of flourishing. Then in 1054, something major happened called the Great Schism, where basically the western half of the empire and the eastern half of the empire, well, split. They were culturally different by then, and everything changed. And right around that same time, in the late 11th century, Muslim armies were encroaching onto Byzantine land more and more, and the Byzantine Empire started to crumble slowly over the next few hundred years. At the same time, this marks the beginning of the Crusades, the Byzantine emperor appealed to the Pope in Rome to try to assemble the armies of Europe to help him fight against these Muslim armies. And that act, the act of the Crusades, kind of signaled the reemergence of the western half of the empire to prominence, cultural prominence. And so, ironically, right at that time, in the 11th century, as the Byzantine Empire started to dwindle, the western part of the empire started to flourish, and that's what I call the High Catholic Age. And so in my book, the different ages I have starts with ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Byzantine Age, and then starting from 1054 specifically to about 1500, I call the High Catholic Age. And that's kind of where the Catholic Church really started to impact Western culture, and a lot of things developed at that time because of that very impact. The Catholic Church promoted the sciences, the arts, the monks and nuns who went throughout Europe. They were developing new ways of farming, engineering. They started universities and hospitals. All that takes place in what we call the Dark Ages, but it's not the Dark Ages. It was the flourishing of a whole bunch of stuff precisely because these Christian monks and nuns were doing it. And within the High Catholic Age, I put what we call the Renaissance, not as some kind of different thing, but really as the culmination of the High Catholic Age. So I put the Renaissance into that age. So thus far, you have ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Byzantine Age, High Catholic Age. Then after that, I have two chapters about two things that happen simultaneously. One is what we would call the Protestant Reformation, but I call it the Protestant Revolution because even though Martin Luther wanted to reform the Catholic Church, the fact is they kind of butted heads, and he ended up revolting against the Catholic Church, and for about 100 years, Protestants and Catholics were warring at each other. And so I call it the Protestant Revolution. Now, I talk about Luther and Calvin and all the big names and how that impacted culture, but I call that the Protestant Revolution. And at the same time, I have another revolution happening at the same time, which I call the Subversive Secular Revolution. If Luther and Calvin revolted against the Catholic Church for religious reasons, there were other people, like Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes and whatnot, they were revolting against the Catholic Church for secular reasons, for purely political, getting power reasons. And so in that chapter, I talk about like the secular revolt against Catholicism, medieval Catholicism. And the interesting thing is how the Reformation religious people and the secular people, sometimes the lines weren't so clear. But that has an effect on how we view things. After that, we have the Enlightenment, but I call it the so-called Enlightenment, as should be obvious. It's not an Enlightenment if there never was a Dark Ages to begin with. That's what they called themselves, the Enlightenment. And that is where I talk about basically the 18th century and the rise of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and I talk about some of the very dangerous writers like Voltaire and Rousseau and whatnot, and how they tried to strip the society completely clear of anything religious, and the impact that had. The Reign of Terror, the guillotine. After the so-called Enlightenment, when I get to the 19th century, I call it the age of the modern Nephilim. And the Nephilim are the fallen ones that are mentioned in Genesis 6. The sons of God go into the daughters of men and they bear for them the Nephilim. And that's a whole issue of what that means. But basically, the Nephilim in that story were fallen ones. That's what the Hebrew word Nephal means. And I view what happens in the 19th century as kind of like that. The Enlightenment thinkers arrogantly said we can get rid of all religion and we can use science and autonomous reason to make us have a utopia. And what we see starting in the 19th century was kind of like the beginning of the fall of everything. That's the rise of Marxism, among others. But then there's a number of other really important thinkers in the 19th century that kind of shape our view. But I call that the age of the modern Nephilim. And then we get to the 20th century, and because the 19th century really tried to blow apart some of the fundamental beliefs of the Christian worldview that had been part of the culture for 1,000 years, the 20th century, we're really seeing the fallout of all that stuff. And I call the 20th century the fanatics, fundamentalists, and foxholes. And basically what I mean by that is what you see in the 20th century, because the overarching Christian worldview has been kind of blown apart, you have everybody retreating to their own ideological foxholes and trying to shoot at each other. You have the rise of Nazism, the rise of communism, ultra-fundamentalism, the eugenics movement. And I talk about what happens in the 20th century by focusing on a lot of that stuff, which we don't really realize how detrimental it is. And then the last chapter, the 21st century, I call, what do I call it? The 21st, and then the last chapter, the last main chapter, the 21st century, I call Mounting Pressures and Crumbling Foundations in a Post-9/11 World. And basically what I do in that last chapter is I then look at where we are today, particularly after 9/11, because that was a big deal, and try to make sense of what's going on today. But again, in light of everything I said in the pre-part, the rest of the early part of the book. So anyway, it's a very interesting book, if I must say so myself. And what I'm going to try to do in the next, I might take 2 weeks to kind of like tease out a couple of things from the book to share with you, because I think it's interesting. And then after that, I will then get back to telling you a little bit more about my next writing project, my next writing projects, my introduction to the New Testament and introduction to the Old Testament. I've already done a lot of writing on it. And in fact, my goal for the New Testament book is to have it kind of the rough draft banged out by the end of the month. And then I could use the summer to kind of tweak it and polish it up enough. And my goal then is to start seeing if I can get an agent and get a big time publisher guy to start getting that process rolling. So anyway, that is the intro to my new book, and that's how I set out the book. And hopefully when you get the book, you'll enjoy it. And when you do get the book, and I'll be positive when you do enjoy it, I would love it if you got on Amazon.com and wrote a review for it, because the more reviews my book gets, the more views it will get. So anyway, thank you very much, and you'll be getting your books probably in the next week or so. Thanks.